Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about personality. So what is personality? Well, personality is often defined as a relatively stable collection of patterns of behavior. Relatively stable collection of patterns of behavior, both psychological behavior and external behavior. In other words, mental processes and behavioral, internal and external behaviors. So I have this example where you see an individual, right? You all know who he is, and we can kind of have an understanding of the personality of the person by repeated patterns of the behaviors and repeated patterns of thinking. But that's what personality is. So there are different perspectives on personality. These are the most influential ones. There are other ones too. The psychodynamic perspective, the trait perspective, the social cognitive perspective. Now, to some extent, we kind of talked about these things in general when we were talking about different schools of thought. But for this particular video, we're going to only talk about one perspective, the humanistic perspective. So in the humanistic perspective, you're going to talk about only two specific questions. We're going to answer these questions. The first one is, what are the key assumptions of the humanistic perspective? Then we're going to move on to talk about some key figures in this field of humanistic perspective. So the first question is, what are the assumptions specific to humanistic perspective of personality? Well, according to humanistic perspective, our conscious choice and our personal freedom. We have both conscious choice to make decisions and a personal freedom to make decisions. Now, if you compare it to other perspectives, especially if you talk about the psychodynamic perspective, we do not have a control. There is no conscious choice, in the sense that our personality, which is determined by our behaviors, right? This personality is based on the internal conflict within an individual. Remember, in the psychodynamic perspective, when we talked about it in general, we said that according to Freud, there is this internal fight between what an individual want to do, which is an instinct, which is usually sex and aggression related, and there is this social pressure of acceptability. And there's always this fight between these two, and what emerges out of this fight is what will determine our behavior, in other words, our personality. In other words, we don't have choice according to that perspective. And if you compare that to the behavioristic perspective, the idea is that our behavior is shaped by the environment we live in. So like rewards and punishment, and so you can change one's behavior by changing the environment, right? So that's like a behavioristic perspective in the sense that we don't have control over it then. Well, humanistic perspective is the opposite of these two. In other words, it's like an alternative. In fact, it is also referred to as a third factor, a third idea that, well, it is not the personality or the behavior of an individual is not determined by the forces from within or determined the forces from outside, but this is actually determined by the individual himself, because individual always has this conscious ability to make conscious choice, and he has personal freedom to do that, which is the key idea of this humanistic perspective. Now, who are some key figures? Now, we will talk about this humanistic perspective as we talk about these individuals and their contributions and the theories they proposed. So first we'll talk about Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers, he proposed a theory called the self theory. Now, according to this self theory, our inner drives, it's like it's a natural instinct. Our inner drives, the natural instincts, they push us to understand ourselves, and this is called self-actualization. And self-actualization is realizing our unique potentials. So each individual is unique, and each individual has unique potentials, and self-actualization is realizing what those unique potentials are. So in that sense, according to Rogers, self-actualization is a self-discovering process. It's a self-discovering process of knowing who you really are, accepting who you are, and then acting in accordance with who you really are. And he developed a theory of self. Remember, we're talking about personality, right? And in that sense, humanistic perspective have this very important concept of self, and it was proposed by Rogers in his theory of self. And it is important for us to understand this, to understand the humanistic perspective of personality. Now, according to Rogers' self-theory of personality, a self is you. When you look at the mirror, there's somebody who looks back at you, right? That person who looks back at you is that self. So your self is the person who looks at you when you look at yourself in the mirror, right? And this person is that distinctive you, the decision maker, right? The moment-to-moment decision maker. It is the one that decides how you relate to yourself with the rest of the world. That's the important point here. Again, we're defining self as that unique person that determines how you relate to yourself with the rest of the world. In other words, what your role is and how you connect with the rest of the world. And what do you think? Whether you're part of it or you're different from it, whatever it is, the decisions, the you makes decisions. The you in you will make the decision about how you relate to yourself with the rest of the world. Then in those decisions is this you making a decision about your self-concept. So there is you, then the you has an idea of who you are, right? That is the concept of self, your self-concept. So to summarize then, self, according to Rogers, is that you who relates yourself with the rest of the world. And it also has a concept of you, which is a self-concept. Together, the actual you and the concept the you has about yourself, together will make up the self. So you and the self-concept. Now, what is the purpose of this self, which is nothing but a function of the you and the self-concept that you has about yourself? What is the purpose of it? Well, the self, it lays foundations for your self-esteem. And self-esteem is how much you like yourself, or in other words, it's actually the value you place on yourself. Self-esteem is the worth you place on yourself, how much you think you value. If you have a high self-esteem, then you think you're worth more. If you have low self-esteem, then you think that you're worth less. So putting a value on yourself would be the self-esteem. And self-esteem is an important aspect of an individual's patterns of behaviors. So it's important to understand how children develop self-esteem. In other words, how children learn to value themselves or determine their value, in other words. So children, the first stage of development of self-esteem is they don't know their value. So they understand their value, they learn their value by relying on how others value them, especially parents. So children develop self-esteem from parents' regard, especially unconditional regard, positive regard. So if you have an individual, if you have a child, and if you are accepting the child as is, irrespective of any behaviors that you might not like about the kid, if you continuously give unconditional positive regard, then the individual will develop self-esteem, because he thinks that, or she thinks that, irrespective of the behavior, the value that is given to this kid from the parents is high, so they'll value themselves more. And children's self-esteem will suffer when parents show not unconditional but conditional positive regard. Well, you're good if you do that. Oh, you're not doing your homework, you're bad. In other words, they're defining the value of the individual based on the behavior of the individual. So they get confused, because sometimes they're valued more, sometimes they're valued less, depending on their behavior. So they don't know their real value. Their value is now tied to the actual behavior. That will hurt their conditioned positive regard. In other words, you value the kid only when they do the way you want them to do. Now, what is self-esteem ultimately then? Well, we've seen that self itself, according to Rogers, is the you plus the concept of self, right? And self-esteem so self-esteem. So we learned that children develop self-esteem based on the way parents treat them. Their self-esteem is high or low depending on the value, depending on the positive regard. Is it conditional or unconditional? So what is self-esteem then? Well, self-esteem you can think of as your real self, right, and your ideal self. It is like the combined. It's a combination, or how fitting the self, the real self, and your ideal self is. So it's a function of self, or the true self, and the ideal self. So Rogers' idea of how we develop self-esteem is that self-esteem is a function of your true self and your ideal self. True self is who you are. Ideal self is what you think you should be, who you are and who you should be. If these are different, right, and then the connection, alignment is not good, then you have lower self-esteem. If your true self and your real self and your ideal self are in line, then you have higher self-esteem. So the closer your ideal self is to the real self, the higher the self-esteem. But if the ideal self you have, who do you want to be, right? If this ideal self of who you ought to be or who you want to be is based on what others expect of us, then our self-esteem suffers. Remember, if your true self is if you want to be a musician and your parents want you to be a doctor, your ideal self is not based on what your real self is, your real interests are, right? Then your self-esteem suffers. So self-esteem is this combination, is how the alignment between the true self and the ideal self. Now, Rogers actually developed the client-centered therapy based on the self-therapy, based on his theories. Here, clients would be helped to know their real self, their real feelings, understand their real self, and accept their real self, then act in accordance with the real self. Then you see that the true self and the real self align well, and they develop self-esteem. Then they start, remember the personality, Rogers' idea of self, and the personality is basically our inner drives push to realize who we are, right? And it's like self-actualization and acting in accordance with it. So in his therapy, clients are helped to understand who they really are, to value the real you. So another theorist in this field is Maslow. Maslow's theory of self. Now, this is quite similar to Rogers' theory of self, where Maslow also emphasizes on self-actualization. And according to Maslow, it is that inner drive towards self-actualization, it will shape our personality. In other words, whether or not you're actually trying to understand who really you are and trying to define your ideal self based on who you are, and then taking those steps to align these two. In other words, really knowing who you are, and then doing in accordance with who you are, will shape your personality. If there's a real alignment, and if you really know who you are and really know what you want to be, so you'll understand your unique potentials. So according to Maslow, this personality, which is the behavioral patterns of individuals, both psychological and external behavioral, right? It's a continuous process of self-growth. Personality then is not fixed, but it is continuously changing because we grow in terms of knowing ourselves. And if we act in accordance with who we are, then it keeps changing. It's a continuous process. So the bottom line for this video is that, well, explore yourself, grow, and grow. Knowing your real self is actually knowing your real ambitions, your real interests, as opposed to somebody else's. Well, thank you very much. And this will be the end of the last video. Thanks.